Welcome to the Science Center. Welcome to our Quorum space. We're delighted to have you here. How many of you have heard of the Science Center? Ooh, that's great. Before you registered for the event. How many of you understand what the Science Center does? Some, that's good. More hands than I expected, but also want to help folks understand that the Science Center is really here to help startups, support startups in the ecosystem. And also we have a STEM cultivation program. And our goal is really around inclusive economic growth for the region. And I love the title of this event because I always want to say ideas you should steal. And I think what's incredibly powerful and really relates to what we do at the Science Center is ideas we should steal, because no individual or organization is going to be able to create the change that we all know is necessary. And so I'm incredibly excited to welcome you here. I think there's incredible power in connectivity and what we can all do together. And so have a great day and a half.
Hello.
Hey all. Oh, can you hear me?
Larry's much louder than I am. Hi, nice to see you. I'm Roxanne Patel-Shepalavi. I am co-executive director of the Philadelphia Citizen.
And I'm Larry Platt, the co-founder of the Citizen. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us for the kickoff to our 5th annual Ideas We Should Steal Festival. As you can tell by the word kickoff, there's more to come tomorrow. So hopefully you all will also be joining us tomorrow at the Comcast Technology Center for a full day of panels and speakers and lunch. If you are interested, somebody at the front desk or Ralph can get you tickets. This is Ralph over there.
Yeah, we're not quite there. We're almost capacity, but not quite. So if you don't have tickets for tomorrow, we'd love to have you. What are you most excited about in this year's festival?
So much. So I'm going to be talking to the architects of Chester's gun violence reduction, which is pretty remarkable and much needed in Philadelphia. I'm excited for you to be talking to, not for you, for Black Thought, who you will be interviewing tomorrow morning, which I think will be exciting.
I have been getting my white man overbite on for days.
Oh dear. What about you? What are you excited about?
Well, last year we had this great conversation with Kasim Reed, the mayor of Atlanta, and Michael Nutter, the former mayor of Philadelphia, and we've now started a podcast with those two guys that's how to really run a city. But tomorrow, Nutter is going to come and be in conversation with Daniel Biss, the mayor of Evanston, Illinois, which is doing the first housing reparations program in the country. And what I love about it is it's being paid for through the proceeds of cannabis sales.
Which is pretty great.
So brilliant policy, and Nutter will speak to whether something like that could be done here.
Yeah, which is great. And I'm sorry, the podcast is what, the 17th most popular podcast among government podcasts.
Yeah. There are probably only 20 such podcasts.
17.
So we owe huge debts of gratitude to our sponsors, and especially Comcast, where we'll be tomorrow. And I know that somewhere here is Brett Perkins of Comcast, he with the beautiful balding black head. But also our visionary sponsors, Darko Capital, United Way of Greater Philadelphia, Independence Blue Cross, Fanatics, and FS Investment. And most importantly, we want to give a shout out to Lenfest Institute for Journalism, our sponsor for this evening's event. Yeah. And if you like that, you're really going to love hearing from its CEO, Jim Friedlich, here to say a few words.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry. I don't know what a white man overbite is, but I look forward to finding it out. I'm afraid I might have one. For those who don't know us, the Lenfest Institute is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated solely to the future of local journalism here in Philadelphia. We're the owner and nonprofit overseer of the Philadelphia Inquirer, which we're quite proud of, in Pennsylvania and throughout the United States. And I'll talk about examples of each of those by way of the panel in a moment. I'm not here as a sponsor tonight. I'm here as a kind of journalism fanboy. Like many of you, I'm an unabashed fan of Ali Velshi, Velshi. Ali, I learned today, was born in Nairobi of civil rights activist Indian parents. He grew up in Toronto. He lives in New York, but he loves hanging out in Philly and lives part of the time in Bryn Mawr. So I'm just delighted to meet you, finally having watched you on air and adoring your work and your boundless energy and your wonderful, wonderful voice. So thank you for leading this incredible conversation about truth and news. I have been for a long, long time since our time together at the Wall Street Journal, and for many years watching the work of Jill Abramson, a fan of your writing, a fan of your leadership at the New York Times. Much of what is great about the New York Times, and I think there's a lot that's great about the New York Times, in 2022 has its origins or was meaningfully accelerated under the leadership of Jill Abramson as the first female executive editor, among other. A powerful, powerful focus on digital storytelling, which sounds like a no-brainer these days, but this is 8-10 years ago. More women and people of color in positions of power and influence at the New York Times and covering issues like Me Too. A deep dedication in all forms to investigative journalism. And I'm very eager to hear about your work at Harvard and this notion of solutions-oriented investigative news. So Jill Abramson. It's a great pleasure, having read for some time the journalism of Emily Bazelon. Am I saying it right? Thank you. Bazelon. Bazelon, sorry. You say that very well. Bylines don't speak. Emily is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine, also a Times person. She is a quite prominent podcaster. Emily has written extensively about women's health issues after the defeat of Roe v. Wade, about unjust incarceration, about bullying, about gender therapy, about child pornography, a host of very, very tough subjects, all with great empathy, wonderful, wonderful reporting. She's a kind of war correspondent, except the war and the battlefield is American justice, American politics, and American culture. So I really look forward to hearing from you. With help from a broad number of funders and a huge number of individual members paying as little as $19 each, Errin Haines and her partners launched the 19th News in 2019, 100 years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment. The name is actually the 19th asterisk, meaning the story is not finished. The 19th News describes itself as a new gender and politics news site focused on many of the most pressing issues of our time, certainly of our electoral politics. Errin is a wonderful editor-at-large of the 19th. She also has been the contributing editor of the Philadelphia Inquirer, writing a series or overseeing a series called The More Perfect Union about systemic inequality that has its roots here in the city of Philadelphia. She is, last but not least, board member of the Lenfest Institute, for which we really appreciate. Thank you. Almost done. Spotlight PA grew out of the Lenfest Institute and the Philadelphia Inquirer, who felt that of the news deserts that are beginning to emerge around the country as local news business models collapse, the most troubling in a way is in Harrisburg and other state capitals, where one of the largest and least transparent state budgets goes underreported. Spotlight PA has really filled that gap quite admirably. It's one of a growing number of nonprofit news organizations that do this, that cover statewide issues, not just the State House. Chris Baxter and his team publish really superb, hard-hitting, nonpartisan investigative journalism, most recently about the midterms here in Pennsylvania, which was the epicenter of the midterms themselves. What's most radical about Spotlight is that Spotlight creates its own content with 23, 25 people, but it gives its news away for free to 90 other newspapers, pretty much every newspaper of note across the state, no matter its political background, every NPR station, most multicultural media, and most news websites use Spotlight PA content absolutely free of charge. So in 3 years, it is a toddler, the same as the almost three-year-old 19th News. This news organization has become the leading civic news organization of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is pretty damn impressive. So, Chris. Finally and quickly, there is so much to admire and to learn from Larry Platt and his colleagues at the Philadelphia Citizen. The banner of the Philadelphia Citizen, the New York Times banner, says all the news that's fit to print. The Philadelphia Citizen says what happened, what it means, and what you can do about it. It's this last piece of the puzzle, which is solutions journalism, true civic engagement, and reader action, that so many of us in local news have been missing, and that so many of us in local news aspire to, putting the citizen back into the news. To coin a phrase, this is an idea that we should steal. And we have. Last week, 52 publishers and community organizations here in Philadelphia, including the Philadelphia Citizen, announced a citywide voter engagement reporting project, a coalition called Every Voice, Every Vote. Every Voice, Every Vote will cover this really critical, seminal 2023 citywide election for both the mayor and for council in an unprecedented way. It'll focus on the issues, not the horse race. It'll focus on what people want from their government, how they wish to hold it accountable, rather than this one is up 2%, this one is down 2%. As the name suggests, the project seeks to engage a diverse group of Philadelphians, underrepresented voices, as well as the powerful, where they live, in churches, barbershops, talk radio, focus groups, and on social media. Each of those are specific grants and specific activities to listen and to inform and to engage in the manner of the Philadelphia Citizen. The project is unusual in its size and scope. 52 community organizations and media to begin with, voter guides in 13 languages. Our partner from Aldea is here, representing Spanish and many, many people in their audience. 150 events planned in every major neighborhood in Philadelphia over 6 to 8 months. Every Voice is led by the Lenfest Institute, funded by William Penn, which has done a great deal for the city, and we're highly grateful to them. The partners include pretty much a who's who of all Philadelphia media, each of the major television stations, the Philadelphia Inquirer, WHYY, all of the major multicultural media, Philadelphia Tribune, Impacto, again, Aldea, the Urban Affairs Coalition, the Enon Baptist Church, kind of you name it, each with a specific mission, a specific audience to engage. The Philadelphia Citizen is not just a partner in this. You have really been a beacon for our work and what we hope to achieve. The Citizen's mission of putting citizens and civic engagement first is really inspiring to us. So this is truly an idea that we should steal. Larry and Roxanne, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim.
Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Jim. What we're doing as part of the Lenfest initiative is called the Ultimate Job Interview. We have a mayoral race ostensibly every 4 years in this town, but we never treat it like it's a job interview. And so we're going to actually crowdsource a job description, and we may even have people walking around today asking you what you think should be in a mayoral job description. And then we're going to have each candidate, and they've all agreed, to come to a town hall individually and stand before a panel of people who actually hire for a living. This is through the generosity of Comcast and also a diversified search firm, people who have expertise in hiring people. And we're going to not ask about issues, not ask about political horse race, but try to predict performance based on past performance, based on hypotheticals, and based on questions that elicit character keys. So we invite you. Those town halls will start in the new year, and we're excited about it. A new way to think about actually hiring a mayor together and getting them all to commit to annual performance reviews while in office. They have. They're all so desperate to get elected that they'll agree to anything right now.
So we don't want to take up any more time from this panel here, except that we are. We just wanted to leave you before we get off the stage and put you in Ali's really capable hands with a video that just tells you a little bit about that hopefully will inspire you a little bit about our mission. Thank you.
Thank you all.
%33% of Philadelphia adults
lack basic literacy skills.
That means about 370,000.
370,000 Philadelphians will struggle to read this sentence.
23% of Philadelphians live in poverty. That is double the national average.
74% of residents with children said they heard gunshots over the past year.
And illegal garbage dumping costs Philadelphia more than $8 million per year.
But if there's one thing we know from our history, it's that these things are all fixable. Just consider.
2020 voter turnout.
It was the highest it's been in 25 years here. You could even say we saved democracy.
Public art, Philadelphia has more of it than any other city.
84% of our homes have high-speed internet access, up from just 70% in 2019.
The COVID-19 vaccine?
Our scientists invented it.
Philadelphians feel this city
is still a good place to live.
A good place to live.
The city is still a good place to live.
And our best days are ahead.
What will it take to get us there? All of us.
I am more than a resident of Philadelphia.
I am its citizen.
And I dedicate myself
to the betterment of my home.
I will stand while others sit.
I will stand while others sit.
I will speak when there is silence.
I will read.
I will act.
I will vote.
I will challenge authority and challenge myself.
I will grow and learn.
I will seek out inspiration.
And I will become an inspiration to others.
I stand for Philadelphia.
It is my home.
And I am its citizen.
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 Thank you, Larry and Roxanne. Thanks for the fantastic introductions of my my panel, because now I can actually spend the entire time talking to them. There was stuff that was even left out of there. This panel is not a group that a young journalist thinks one day they'll be able to moderate and talk about the future of truth and democracy in journalism. This is actually a very big deal to me, because these four panelists have different experiences in different things that are all centered around our struggles for democracy and for liberty and for social justice and the truth. And I guess we have to use the truth as a starting point in this conversation. And I think part of the problem, Errin, this is my good friend Errin Haines, and I love what you do, and I'm so glad to be with you again. I've been a supporter of what Errin does, by the way, since day one.
You have been a day one supporter.
And you all should be. But it's interesting, because the 19th Amendment, as you know, maybe you know the text of it, but it's about not discriminating against people in any form on the basis of their sex. It was the right to vote is what we think about, but it's actually much broader than that. And it's not a lens through which I look at my life, right? I don't think the right to vote for women, how does that affect me, or reproductive rights? But when you start to look at it more broadly, you realize that either we have rights or we don't. Either our democracy is moving toward perfection or it's not. Either our union is becoming more perfect or it's not. Either we're getting better at this or we're not. And I think a lot of us would say, we're sort of not. The last few weeks has made us feel like maybe we're not as badly as we thought we were, but we have a problem. And some of you may wonder, and this is coming to you, Jill, some of you may wonder why we as journalists, particularly me as a cable news journalist, have the gall to have this conversation about the public's trust having eroded in the media or in institutions, because some people would say you were part of it. Some people would say you caused it. Some of it was deliberate because it got us ratings and it sold our newspapers, and some of it was inadvertent because those are the stories we told. And Jill, you wrote in 2019, but I know you've been thinking about this for a long time, that things we've done, sometimes in good faith in our industry, have contributed to the erosion of that faith in us right now. I don't think it's most of it. I don't think that if half of America doesn't trust journalism, I don't think we're responsible for that. But you and I share the view that we're responsible for some of it.
And that there have definitely been some self-inflicted wounds over the past decade, big and serious ones. When I go places and talk about the times, people still bring up, the lead up to the war in Iraq and all of the bad, untrue coverage of WMD, which the Times was very much promoting in real time. And, that's an example of a self-inflicted wound. I think that the trust numbers are very concerning. They are at an all-time low, like as we sit here on this panel. And, certainly that's part of an erosion in trust in all American institutions. But journalism, even discounting for that, is still very low on the trust meter. And, I feel it's urgent to do as much as we can to move the needle in the opposite direction through doing, the best work there is. And what's frustrating is that I think the best work, that the best journalism I've read or watched or listened to is being done right now. Investigative journalism is better, and there's more quality journalism than ever before. Like many of you, I begin my morning reading, and, I'm overwhelmed with how many stories I want to read, but there's only so much time. And, I think there are various things that we can talk more about that can be done, but the thing that worries me the most is, during the back end of my career at the Times, and certainly in the last 10 years, the fragmentation of the audience is fueling, I think, the distrust and the difficulty of establishing, truth is the first word of our panel, in having any sense of a common truth in this country. And, social media is, not, I wouldn't say the sole thing to blame for that fragmentation, but it has accelerated it greatly.
Yeah, we started it. They just picked up where we didn't have the power to.
Right. But I'm an eternal optimist, and I do think there are a lot of things that journalism can do to reestablish a bond and a faith in truth with the audience, the people that we write and chase the news for.
Thank you. Errin, you look like you had a...
Yeah, I think thinking about a lot of what Jill had to say, what you wrote in 2019, where I was in 2019 was covering a Democratic primary that was the most diverse it had ever been, where you saw 6 women running for president, and yet the way that we were talking about race and gender in our American political system was the same as it had always been. And why wouldn't it be, right? Political journalism was still too white. It was still too male. And we were getting ready to repeat the mistakes of the 2016 election and all the elections that had come before it in political journalism, because we still had the same gatekeepers, we still had the same storytellers. And so how were we going to get a different outcome? And so that's really where I was in 2019. And frankly, you know, a lot of my colleagues who are black journalists saw a lot of the racial dynamics that were happening and had tried to call those things out. Their lived experience was seen as a liability and not an asset to their journalism, and the lens that they were able to bring to what I think a lot of us now acknowledge we're seeing in our politics and our democracy. And so, you know, starting the 19th was really about trying to change that narrative, trying to figure out really who are the audiences that we are prioritizing, right? Why are we talking about half the population, half the electorate, namely women, as a special interest group? You know, why are we still doing that in 2020? Why is the rising Democratic majority, small d Democratic majority in this country, marginalized, people who have been historically marginalized, why are we not seeing them as voters, right? And not just, people who can also care not just about race or just about gender, but about the economy, but about the court system, about education, about, you know, why don't they get to be rural voters? Why don't they get to be blue-collar workers, right? Who are we talking about? How are we talking about them? Who is included in our democracy? And so, you know, Jim had mentioned that there's an asterisk in our logo, if you've ever seen the 19th logo, and that is one, in recognition of the black women who were thrown under the bus in 1920 when the 19th Amendment was passed, but also in recognition of people who remain unseen and unheard in this democracy. And we have to be thinking about them because there's a reason that they don't trust us. They haven't felt seen and heard by us as journalists. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, you know, at our core, we are supposed to be righting wrongs, speaking truth to power, afflicting, you know, the comfortable, but really leaving behind the most honest and accurate record of who and where we are as a country. And if you are ignoring half the population, you know, as full participants in this democracy, if you are ignoring folks who are increasingly becoming the majority of this country, that is frankly a form of misinformation, in my opinion. And it is not the best journalism that we can be doing. And so I felt like the best and fastest way to really address that was to try to start over.
Which is great, and that sort of, I think, ups everybody's game, so thank you for doing that. Errin's often on my show dispensing some of this wisdom to my viewers, so I'm grateful for it.
I do enjoy sharing a screen with you, but it's nice to be here in person.
It is nice to be here in person with you. Thank you, my friend. Emily, you wrote something in 2020 that was certainly very relevant and has aged very well, except that it almost feels like you could have written it last week. You said in a piece for the New York Times Magazine, it was titled, "The Problem of Free Speech in the Age of Disinformation." You said the United States was in the midst of an information crisis caused by the spread of viral disinformation defined as falsehoods aimed at achieving a political goal, end quote. You argue, and again, this last 6 weeks or so with our friend Elon Musk has made this very clear, that this is a result of the absolutist American way of thinking about free speech. I'm not convinced, and I'm a business reporter, so there's a lot about Elon Musk that I've admired in the past, but I don't think he's read a pamphlet on free speech. He seems to have a fundamental misunderstanding of it. Yeah. So do a lot of people. And they see these tweets and they think that things are censorship that aren't, and they have these views about, what does he say, that this town square he's creating is going to be this fantastic thing. I don't know if anybody's been to a town square, but it's not like that. It's not like Twitter, because if there were town squares like Twitter, no one would go to a town square.
Yeah, he also seems fundamentally confused about the role of government action in the First Amendment. The First Amendment guarantees that the government will not infringe on your free speech rights, not that Twitter won't have content moderation. I wrote that piece at a time where I was incredibly concerned about the kind of avalanche of disinformation. And I use that term on purpose. I mean deliberately planted and disseminated lies.
Thank you. Sorry, everyone. Now I'll stop yelling. Maybe. And I think that the biggest problem I see with the fragmentation is that when you are almost exclusively, or your media diet is dominated by right-wing sources, you're going to get facts that are different, and often different and wrong than the mainstream media is reporting. And if it turns out those facts are wrong, they're not going to tell you afterward, usually. These big defamation suits that Dominion voting systems have been bringing are evidence of that. It's unusual, though, to have one injured plaintiff who can sue for disinformation. You can't have that kind of action when the problem is, the vaccines for COVID don't work, or the election was stolen. So I think that is a huge problem. I also think that the mainstream media has this enormous problem with trust that Errin and Jill were talking about, and that's more complicated. We're supposed to have solutions. I don't have a solution for that right now. Maybe someone else up here will.
Local news.
Yeah.
Start a newsroom.
Except to say that I think Spotlight PA and the 19th are such good examples of how you can reinvent news products and make them so much better. So my first job was for a local newspaper in California called the Tri-Valley Herald. I learned a lot there. I'm really grateful that I got to make mistakes before there was an internet. It wasn't a very good newspaper. The fact that it's gone is okay if there are these other alternatives. And then, to me, the big issue is how are they financially sustainable? Because one of the reasons that newspapers traditionally were the way they were is that they were cash cows. They had all this display advertising from local merchants and national merchants. There was this marriage between news and advertising commerce that was really convenient. Before the internet, we didn't know that nobody was reading the stories, even some of the good investigative stories. Now we know that, and we need a sustainable model for outfits exactly like the 19th and Spotlight PA, because they're better in a lot of respects from what we had before. It's just that the finances are precarious. So that was something I would love to hear.
That was an excellent intro into Chris, so I appreciate that. Thank you. Chris, and you can respond to any part of that, because I agree with Emily that with the 19th and Spotlight PA and organizations like this, why not just reinvent the way we do some of these things? Some of us work for legacy organizations that are it's a hard ship to turn, and we should keep trying, but you could just do it a different way. One of the things that you're focused on, particularly in the coverage of the 2022 elections here in Pennsylvania, which is where democracy could live or die, was not to focus on horse race and poll stuff, but actually to talk about something that Emily just talked about, pre-bunking BS. We should all be fact checkers as journalists. I didn't realize when I signed up for this that we're all fact checkers all the time on every story all the time, and then 2 times more.
In real time.
That everybody's lying to you every time they're talking to you. But we should all be fact checkers. And you decided at Spotlight PA to sort of figure out what was out in the ether that was nonsense and try and get ahead of it?
Yeah, first I think we have to understand that the crisis in journalism is really a local crisis. Too often, and it's certainly no offense to anyone here, but too often the conversation is dominated by the national media, and the trusted media numbers tend to be very much dominated by people's impressions of the national media, often mostly cable news.
No offense taken.
And we, on a local level, right, are trying to rewrite that script, as you mentioned, in a very much an uphill battle. But we know that locally, right, legacy newsrooms, presence in state legislatures, in state government meetings, people aren't there anymore. And that hollowing out of local journalism doesn't just sit and exist. It's being filled by disinformation. It's being filled by political actors on both sides of the aisle. It's being filled by dark money interests pushing agendas, setting up shadow news networks and sites that look like local news but really aren't, that exist here all over Pennsylvania and elsewhere. And we also know that when we put a reporter in a room, or we have a reporter actually have a conversation with someone in a community, that interaction has a tremendous effect on the perception then of that reporter and journalism and what they do. So with Spotlight PA, yes, first and foremost, it was we need to cover a massive state legislature that is basically operating in the dark. But we also need to reconnect people with Harrisburg, but also with one another in communities to understand that they have a lot in common, and that historically we see that a lot of the preservation of power in Pennsylvania is in part predicated on keeping people separate and distinct. We have a lot of separate and distinct regions. We have a unique geography. We have a lot of cultural identities. And part of the way Harrisburg sort of persists is by preserving those differences. So with Spotlight PA, it was about kind of filling that void, returning journalism back home, right? Redefining journalism back to what it's supposed to be, which is in the hands of communities, not in the hands of giant corporations and hedge funds, in the hands of people responsive to the people, and providing information and pathways for people to make a difference. And so when we think about the election, right, the kind of common journalism narrative around fact-checking has been, we need to check every fact, right? Well, that's simply impossible. But we also know from research and data that the process of fact-checking, unless done in a very, very specific way, which most often is not, actually serves to reinforce the negative or the negative information as much as it does to reinforce or implant the positive. So in thinking about that and just a sort of massive fire hose, we need to kind of rethink that in terms of laying a foundation of facts before we're responding to every little misinformation. So laying a foundation of civic information for people to understand government processes, to understand how to vote, to understand why results will change in the day after the election, to write all of these things in advance and provide a foundation. Because the way, and I'm sure Emily has looked at this with her work, the way mis and disinformation works is first there's a state of confusion that is created. Whether that state of confusion is purposeful, as in the case of disinformation, or whether it's sort of by accident or just by nature in the case of misinformation, the state of confusion comes before the taking hold of the disinformation, because people are confused about something, they start to reach around to look for an answer, and that gives opportunity for bad actors, political actors, whatever have you, to make a connection and try to get their fact or to get their action done. That's where the opportunity is created. So with Spotlight PA in the latest election, we know, right? We know from 2020, we know from being here on the ground and understanding the state where those areas of confusion exist or where they might come up. Because we're on the ground, we understand what the lawmakers are doing. We understand in a very deep sense how they operate here, how they operate the systems, how they operate the levers of power. And so in advance, we will write stories about those areas of confusion that we know will exist. We'll write stories about things that didn't happen, which is sort of a novel concept. News is supposed to be about things that happen, right? Well, sometimes we will write about things that did not happen because we know and can tell that if we don't address that first, it's an area where mis and disinformation could really take off. Mail balloting, huge issue here, lots of confusion, major point source for disinformation and misinformation. We attack that head on. The changing of results because of mail balloting, because of legislative inaction to make counting quicker and easier on the counties. Again, there's a reason that some of these things haven't changed. They create points of confusion, and points of confusion for political operators are points of opportunity for mis and disinformation. That's what we're trying to attack on the real local level. And one last thing I'll say about that, why the local level matters. State legislators are now the incubator for our democracy. It is not the federal level. State legislators, legislatures, and local school boards are the ones making the decisions that are affecting your pocketbook, that are affecting your children's education, that are affecting your retirement. They have fewer and fewer reporters and accountability reporters covering them, and they are now the testing ground for national efforts. The abortion law that came out of Texas was tested and tried and tested in state legislatures. The independent state legislature doctrine was tested and tried and came out of state legislatures. That is where it is happening, and that is where we have to focus. If the conversation just stays national, we're gonna miss the whole kit and caboodle, and we're gonna miss our chance to stop it.
And so if you haven't read up on independent state legislature theory, you should, because this is where democracy could actually be made or broken. You're right. It was in North Carolina. It was actually a state legislature effort to say we're preeminent. We don't have to answer to courts, and most people don't think about this stuff. And this accountability journalism, the fact that you're showing up in a legislature covering these people, that alone is part of the accountability, right? Just the idea that they know someone will actually be there. So
yeah, because the presence bends the arc of accountability over time. It's not just about writing a story that gets a bill introduced or gets someone indicted. I mean, that's great. We want to drive that kind of change, but there's also change in being present and being a force, and that sort of that bending that arc of accountability over time. And the North Carolina case is a great example. That comes out, but what we see then is lots of other state legislatures, they start talking about it. You start to see bits of it
Can
moving
I
in
break
legislature.
in for a second? Because I think an important component of why that is and what drives it is right-wing dark money. I mean, the Kochs and like-minded right-wing billionaires have they've founded organizations. One focused on state government is ALEC. Which, probably very few people here know what ALEC is.
Put a show of hands if you know what ALEC is, ALEC. Okay.
Okay, well, that's heartening.
I think in the 13th, they
Yeah,
really did a
right.
really good
They
job
did.
of
They
illustrating
did.
what it's
I
a
agree.
major lobbying
But
organization.
it's not just
They
ALEC.
write model bills. That's
The-
what
yeah,
ALEC
Right,
is.
model
Model
bills,
legislation.
The right wing has completely taken over the Republican associations of all of the local office holders who run elections, who are in charge of votes being counted fairly. I mean, it's really something, and the liberals and Democrats are running like way behind. This happened from Reagan's presidency on in a very concerted, strategic way, and it's just.
But isn't that our job, like to talk about things like?
Well,
ALEC is a great example,
but
right?
I'm just saying it makes the work of local investigative reporting so important, because that's the only thing left that can push back.
But it also just has to be there. I mean, you look at these local news deserts. I mean, I can remember, covering Barack Obama's first election. So being out on the campaign trail, this is 2008, when there were still, local newspapers on the campaign trail in places like Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina and all these Super Tuesday states. And you could go to these states and go to some of these smaller towns that had local journalism. You get the local paper. You read the letters to the editor that they are writing. You understand that is part of the fabric of that community, that these people are in conversation and in relationship with their newspaper, right? And that there's a trust that was there, right? That trust is gone. To Chris's point, what's filling the void? Fox News and talk radio, right? And so you hear people in the middle of the country talking about critical race theory, which is not happening where they are, right? And you understand those are talking points that are coming from a national, the only national news outlet where they're getting their news, right? Because their local newspaper is gone, right? And that those local newspapers were informing at one point that the national media that was parachuting in, right, and trying to get a sense of what was going on in that community. They don't have that. They don't have that, and that is a huge part of the problem, just the erosion of local news. Because if you have local media outlets that are in relationship with those communities, I know it seems like it's a lot to go up against dark money and these big, somebody in the middle of the country, they don't know the Koch brothers, but they know the publisher of that paper. And if the publisher of that paper says, no, you are not disenfranchised, here is the information that you need to cast the ballot successfully. If you get something in the mail that tells you no, your newspaper tells you yes, this is what you can do. These are your rights. These are the rules, right? They might trust that person that they know over the flyer that they got in the mail or the robocall that they got, if that place exists. There's too many places where it does not exist anymore, and that is a huge part of the problem.
If the place exists is the question. Emily, you are covering a number of stories. I know you're covering the courts, so the ISL doctrine is important to you. You're obviously covering reproductive rights and abortion. You're covering a lot of stories that are subject to this disinformation. What do you do about it? Because you just report. Like, what do you do? My colleague Ben Collins at MSNBC says, the falsehoods spread on the internet far faster than any of us can pat them down. So how do you think about that? Does it matter to you? Does the way you construct a story today look different than it did 10 years ago?
I think that the way we frame stories is sometimes different as a result of that. So I have the luxury of choosing some of the things I write about, and I tend to pick things that I think are hard because I want to make people think about the complexities. And I try really hard to have whatever conclusion I'm drawing be very clearly drawn from the evidence and the reporting in the piece, so you can follow the breadcrumbs with sometimes a lot of links. I know people don't often click through them, but they're such a resource, right? It's a way of sort of checking our homework often along the way, and there are more resources there for people who are interested. So I think that it's this issue of framing. I also think it's really important when you're thinking about information to remember what it's like to have beginner's mind about a subject, because most people who come to a subject are not covering a beat. They haven't gotten to spend months diving in, and they don't know, and they may or may not be open to being persuaded. But if you can't go back to what it feels like not to know things, then you're going to be talking over people's heads. So I try really hard to do that. And I also try to think about readers who don't agree with me, because I don't want to be preaching all the time to a choir, whatever that choir might be. I want to imagine a world in which people are reading my stories, even if they don't come through the New York Times website. Maybe they'll get there through social media or through a friend, and maybe their politics are really different from mine, but I want them to see that I'm trying to think about a question from more than one point of view. Because I fear otherwise about this fragmentation and that loss of trust that for
You don't want to be discounted because you don't know that there's another point of view.
Yes,
or accept it.
And I don't want the New York Times to seem blind to
Yes,
considerations.
and this is honestly what Ali is so good at, and why I think that you are so effective on your show. We have to meet audiences where they are. Your Ali Across America tour, getting out there, talking to people, bringing the show to people, hearing what their concerns were instead of telling them what they should care about. We, as a profession for too long, have tried to dictate what the issues were to the people as opposed to being in relationship with them, hearing from them about what they care about, what their concerns are, and also how they want to engage with us, right?
I think the language you choose is so interesting, being in
Yes.
relationship with them, right? We're not you're not thinking of yourself as a service provider. You're not thinking yourself. You're thinking about something. That's how I grew up. We watched the news because it was important to allow you to make decisions that were about your safety, your prosperity, your health.
But you have to believe that this is a public service.
Yeah.
Equal emphasis on the public and the service. And if you don't believe that, then that is going to dictate how you are executing what it is that we do.
Well, that's what governs you, and that's what governs you, and I think that's amazing in the fact that that's your ethos, and it comes through in the writing. Jill, before Donald Trump hijacked my career, I was a simple financial journalist from Canada, and so I was intrigued to hear you saying that talking about the influence of money in journalism, because you've expressed this concern otherwise, not just about dark conservative money. You've just generally expressed a concern about the blurring of lines.
Investigating the role of money in politics.
Long time.
Oh my God, it's embarrassing to say.
No, it's great.
But I mean, I was given the gift of that beat at the Wall Street Journal in 1985. At a point where, believe it or not, there were almost no other reporters focused on it. Now, the money chase and the influence of money is, one of the dominant, subjects of any election.
Do you have hope in
coverage.
certain moments, though, where you see, for instance, in the 2022 midterms, where
You-
there was a narrative about inflation being this, and there was, in the green room, Errin made this great point that why do we think that if inflation is somebody's top concern, abortion can't actually be
Right.
their concern, or democracy can't also be their concern?
Gun violence.
Right. Do you feel that people are trying to reclaim their democracy from corporate interests and from big moneyed interests?
I do, and I think, it's a real desire, but I think they don't have a knowledge just of what incoming messages and information are actually coming from, very interested ideological agents. And so that, I
Do you
think
go as far as to talk
interrupts
about,
it.
is Comcast a sponsor here?
But- But back to money for a minute. I mean, one good thing is, there's like epic money spent in many of these Senate races, including Georgia. When you include the runoff,
Here.
it's just like
mind-boggling, right? Yeah.
But money didn't decide
Money doesn't equal votes.
these races, which I am happy about, even though it was like $1 trillion.
It was crazy. I thought when I reported it on
election.
TV, I thought we had the graphic wrong. Because I thought to myself, that's almost $1 trillion. And so,
Right.
yeah, that's actually true.
So money didn't decide it, and very excitingly, what did decide it is independent women.
Hello.
All of these races were so close. It was mainly independent, many of them registered Republicans who just would not go for these Trump-endorsed whack-ball candidates. And hallelujah.
And who were horrified about the idea that they were less free and equal than their mothers, grandmothers, that their great daughters and granddaughters might be less free and equal.
The abortion
Abortion,
issue,
voting
like,
rights,
was
you name it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you about this, Emily, because you're deep into this particular topic. And as I was going across the country in my visits to people, it did seem that people were seeing their voting choices as binary. There were people influenced by the idea that inflation is the biggest concern, and though it's a global phenomenon, Joe Biden and his folks were responsible for all of it, and others who felt that abortion was the end, the erosion of democracy as they knew it. And as Errin points out, and by the way, as the voters ended up pointing out, you can hold two thoughts in your mind at the same time. You can hold several thoughts in your mind at the same time. But how do you think about that? Because you've been covering abortion and reproductive health, and it's in the last 8 months, it's become more wildly politicized than it's been in the prior 50 years.
It was a miracle that people cared about these things that I write about all the time. I couldn't believe it. I write about reproductive rights and threats to democracy, and so I think there's a way in which when you cover something and you're constantly thinking like, oh my God, are people responding? Is there enough audience for this? And then it seems like it matters.
But literally a year ago, people would say, what are you carrying on about? Abortion rights
But
are not
again,
those.
what people? Black women were on the front lines of this issue for decades. Their bodily autonomy has been at issue since they were enslaved and brought to this country. They have been sounding the alarm for this. It was not until white women realized, oh shit, my rights might be taken away here. Ring the alarm. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about this? Like, no. Who finally decided to care after Dobbs fell? The people who never were worried about their rights being taken away in the first place, not the people who have been fighting for their rights that have always been fragile in this country.
But that's fundamentally the question, right, that we're trying to address. It's fundamentally the question you're trying to address. I can't just wait until my particular right is infringed upon to decide that democracy's falling.
And that's why the shared truth, shared fate conversation is so important.
Right. And so this goes back to, did you look at Me Too as something you play a role in? Did you look at Black Lives Matter as something you play a role in? Do you look at Dobbs as something you play a role in? Does your ability to get access to things affect how you think about that? And on a local level, how do you square that? Because on one level, you're telling people about things that affect them very directly. On another level, how do you get people to think about things that may not affect them directly, but that they need to think about? Like reproductive rights, like Black Lives
think it starts with understanding them, right? With being there and understanding how they're making decisions, how they're living their lives. We talk a lot when we do small groups around the state. We're all over the state constantly, and we talk to people about this. One of the number one questions I get is, your work is great, everything you're doing is great, but aren't you worried that nobody's listening? That it's that everyone's sort of already made up their mind. They're already in their fiefdom, and I understand where that comes from, but I fundamentally reject the idea that that's the majority, because if that were the majority, then we would be Russia. Like, we would already be there. The idea that we don't have voters and people in communities that are considered, that can hold four thoughts in their head, that want to actually know about the issues and make a vote on the issues. If we don't accept that that's still true for the majority of people, then we've got a big problem. So we talk a lot about that in these forums, because we want people to understand you still have agency in your government. You still have agency with your vote to the money conversation.
Well, the Georgia election is a point of that, right? For all the trying to keep everybody from voting, people got the message that you have agency.
Yes. Yeah.
And they went out and voted in recognition.
The barriers remain significant.
The barriers are correct.
And-
hold two thoughts
Both
in your
things
head.
can be true.
that framing,
there are barriers
right?
to voting, and people went out there and said, I will wait in line. I will do what I have. I'll bring my own damn water, but I'm going to vote.
And there was also a shift for us, I think, as a political journalism class, to not say, oh, look at these heroes out here in line waiting for water, as opposed to saying, it's really wrong that these people are still here 4 hours, 6 hours, 8 hours later, right? Like, yes, what they are doing is heroic, but they shouldn't have to do it, right? Instead of just praising those voters, right? You can also condemn the system that puts them in a position to be heroic.
I think that's a really important point, that people, part of the erosion of local news has been the erosion of that relationship, and that they could pick up the phone and talk to someone that they understood who ran the place and what values they had. And I think that people are just really kind of looking for that. People aren't stupid, and they want quality information, and they're looking for people to fill that to be there with them and to help empower them in that role. And I think that's just such an important part of the local equation. We talk all the time. People aren't stupid. The problem is that we're not. Journalism is so broken, right? That is now incumbent on us to prove our value, to help people understand. I mean, again, to my point, bring journalism back home, back to its roots, back the good parts of it, back to community service, public service, and standing for something, right? It's not being partisan to say that if we pay for the government, we have a right to know how the government spends our money. If we elect officials, we have a right and expectation that they'll be ethical and honest. Right? We're not afraid as a news organization to go out and talk to people about that. And what we hear is that they appreciate it because they understand who we are and where we're coming from. It's not about being partisan. It's the same thing as saying we believe a free press is fundamental to a strong democracy. If we're willing to say that, then we should be more willing to say some of these other things that we all stand for, that are universal.
But I think we haven't said that other part enough. Like, you talk about telling the truth. Like, we were under a president who lied about what journalism is and what the press was and the role of the press in our democracy is. Journalism has to tell the truth about who we are and what we stand for and what our relationship is to this country. That is something that I think we didn't realize that we still needed to do, but clearly, given the approval ratings, this is we need to keep telling that story, and that is a big truth that we need to keep telling in the face of the big lie that journalism is bad.
But this big lie. The reason it's called the big lie is because there's been a big lie in the past, and the playbook's the same, Jill. Whether it was Rwanda, or whether it was the former Yugoslavia, or whether it was Hitler's Germany, the lie is the same thing, and it starts with targeting groups, and it often starts with either targeting or controlling the media. So Erin's point is valid that we do need to do this work, and maybe it wasn't clear to all of us that we needed to do this work, but actually history would have told us you need to do this. The first day Donald Trump came out and said, look at that, there's nobody here, nobody out here. And he was lying.
No, I think the lie was that he had a bigger inaugural crowd than Obama. It was the opposite.
Can't even finish your sentence.
The opposite, but
Day one. Set the tone.
Yeah. So what do we? Let's say that what Errin just said is true. That we have to do the work to rebuild. What does that
I think first and foremost, it's to quote Marty Baron, who was the great editor of the Washington Post, would always say when asked this kind of question, do the work. Do the work. Do great quality journalism. That is number one, the best way to restore. And I think, your point about spotlight and local media that's so important is that you and your journalists have a stake in the health of your community. And you mentioned, who the ownership of I think we're all dead.
I think Errin might have the last.
We're
I don't
supposed
know.
to stop
Oh,
talking.
wait.
No?
I took her dead one, so you guys share that one, give me that one, and we'll I'll collect all the bad mics.
Yeah, this one does work. Is, local newspapers, we lived through when they were owned by chains like Gannett, which owned a whole lot of regional and local newspapers. The owners now are, and back then, even though they were chains, the journalists and editors of those papers did have a stake in the communities that they covered. Now those papers are owned by vulture funds, by private equity firms that hollow them out, reduce the size of the newsroom, are located in office towers in New York and LA, and they have no connection to any community other than the community of money. And so, bringing back local news, quality local news that is giving people stories that help them make the fundamental decisions about their lives that are crucial, that's the baseline. It really is.
Just to support that and the work that Errin and Chris are doing, nothing in the First Amendment prevents public funding to journalistic enterprises like these. We have been, as a country, like even talking about that, Americans, we've had this whole conversation without mentioning it because it's not how Americans have paid for the media traditionally. But in this moment in which, we have the kinds of corporate takeovers and models Jill's talking about, we need a way to pay people to do the work. And there are ways to insulate, there are ways to have government provide funding where you can also try to insulate the media organizations from the kind of partisan political control and government interference that really is a problem. New Jersey has done a little bit of experimenting with this. I know we're in Philadelphia, not New Jersey, I understand, but that is something to consider. And, in a lot of ways, since the solution is state and local, the solutions to this kind of issue could also be state and local, and you can think of the states as the laboratory of democracy and experimenting with methods of public funding that can support this kind of work. You like that, Errin? Good.
I'm going to hand it over to Larry to hand it over to you. This is great. I mean, we've gone in so many interesting directions. Clearly, there's a great deal of work to be done, Larry, in bringing trust back to journalism. But we've got a panel of people who are committed to doing it and to answering some questions.
Yeah. So I'm gonna, and I apologize for all of the microphone difficulties. But we believe so much in democracy that we want to turn the microphone over to you guys. Please keep it brief, and this isn't the Senate, so no filibusters. And I'll run around like Phil Donahue. I don't know if anyone remembers Phil Donahue. I got to come up with and I'm going to try and be geographically diverse here as well. Yes, sir. And I'll hold the mic to ensure against...
I'm always amazed how you, journalists, have the stomach to listen to the right wing when they present disinformation. How do you handle that personally? How do you prevent yourselves from going berserk?
It's an interesting question because lots of things would have made journalists go berserk over the years, but this is a newish one in the last 5 or 6 years that
No, it's not new.
well, it's new.
It's
in that-
been going on my whole career.
Right, but you don't have a president who gave speeches every day, who came out and did press conferences in which they were lying every day.
No,
The velocity has increased.
Yeah, and you know, the lie machine has gotten much stronger, but it's not new, that's all I'm saying.
When you hear Tucker Carlson or Kennedy,
I'm usually busy that time of night. I don't react personally. They, in fact, every now and then they like to feature me, and I think that's fantastic because I would talk to anybody. I mean, as Errin said, I'd make a point of going around the country to talk to people with whom I disagree. I don't think everybody has to, and I think some people rightfully do not want to do that, and they don't want to engage in that. I think it's part of my job specifically, so I do it, but it's not always pleasant. In fact, it's sometimes unpleasant because I'm moderating those conversations, and people say some nasty stuff, but I will tell you that when you bring them together like this, which is how I do it, I bring 6 people together, they do fundamentally respect each other more than they would on Twitter, or more than they would when they're yelling at someone. When they're actually here and they have to look at each other, we leave, everybody wants a selfie when we're finished. They're on complete opposite sides of the political spectrum, and they want to take a picture of each other.
Yeah, people are not thinking about their neighbors as the people that are on Twitter. Maybe if they did, they might behave better. For me, having covered race for the better part of the last 2 decades, for most of my career, covering race really equipped me to cover politics better. Most political journalists did not cover race, but if you covered race and covered politics, you could do it much better because you know what you're looking at.
Interesting.
I want to answer your question with honesty, though. The day that Roe was overturned, I was berserk that day. I truly was.
We got one over here.
Yeah, a partner Mukherjee, newly of Resolve Philly, another Lenfest and other local media organization.
Welcome.
Thank you, Sally. A question based on what Emily was pointing out about local public sector subsidies of news. There is a totally distinct but related piece between trust in media and sustainability of media. Those two are related, certainly, but say we occupied a universe in which public subsidies were 100% there. What do you think the trust part would be outside of the sustainability question?
Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, I think in some ways you can look to Europe for this answer, right?
Or even Canada.
Or Canada. I know less about Canada, so you're going to fill in Canada. I was thinking, for example, of the BBC, which, you know, has always had public funding. I mean, NPR and PBS have some of that in the United States, but much less in terms of the percentage of their revenue. So, you know, I think if the media product seems like it is nonpartisan and it is available and it is plugged into local communities, then it seems to me that the sustainability piece is going to carry it, and that people may feel good about the fact that that's what they're part of what their taxpayer dollars are going to. Maybe that seems naive.
Well, there's a virtuous cycle there because if it accepts public funding, BBC and other similar entities like CBC in Canada do maintain outposts in places that commercially viable entities wouldn't go to.
Exactly.
So you then end up covering stories that you didn't know you would cover, and no one would mistake that for a commercial venture. A Canadian consumer watching that stuff on TV is not going to think someone's making money out of covering that story. So you develop a certain respect for the institutions because you're saying someone's covering that because it's important, not because it's economically viable. So I think it actually feeds off itself. It's a really interesting question.
We have one right here. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I want to come back to the word "do your work." There's work, and it seems to me, at one point I looked at what was being taught in the high schools, and I discovered that, in fact, the amount of history and civics, I mean civics in the real sense of what was being debated in the Constitution, has disappeared. I took, at least when I was in high school, 2 or 3 semesters of history. And also, it seems to me there are deserts now in the high schools in which there are not student newspapers. You do not have a readership if you do not prepare them for in the first 12 years of their education, where they begin to learn how to do it, how to be critical, how to read it, etc. It's too late at the point in which...
I agree with you. We're not fixing us.
Great. We need us some Schoolhouse Rock. You guys remember Schoolhouse Rock?
Isn't that weird that
It's
that's what you think of?
news literacy is a part of civics education.
Yeah.
Sure. So I'm loving that a lot of your solutions are collaborative and sort of community oriented, but in America we have such an ethos of individualism. And so how do you kind of reconcile some of this solutions-based thought with the fact that a lot of people seem to be only invested in themselves?
Because the ethos of the 19th is that we're all in this together, right? Like, I mean, you think about the 19th Amendment, the suffragists that pushed for, nearly a century before the 19th Amendment even came into existence, right? There were, that coalition was diverse until it wasn't, right? But we have a chance to do this better. And I think that people are beginning to understand. I think certainly in the pandemic, a lot of people began to understand the pandemic of, public health, but then also of the racial reckoning of 2020 that, hey, what happens over here today could happen to me tomorrow, could happen to you the next day. And so, the idea that we should all care about everything that is happening in our democracy, whether it's directly affecting us or not, like that is the case that we try to make in our journalism every single day. And I think that is the best of journalism when it helps people kind of come to the universal truth, right, that we are trying to tell about who and where we are.
Let's do right here.
What do you say, dude? How you doing? A wise man told me a long time ago that there are 3 sides to every story. Yours, mine, and the truth. And unless you're getting both sides, you will never know the truth, not even by accident. And what we've come to is a one-sided conversation here, except it's not a conversation, it's a rant. And when you talk about, the influence of certain right-wing, in all honesty, the media overall is heavily weighted toward the liberal voice. If you do a count, it's Fox against the world. So to say that they're the problem, I'm going to give you an example, Jill, and I don't mean to pick on you, but you mentioned a name. No, this isn't an argument, it's a discussion. You mentioned the name, Koch. You forgot Soros. So it's on both sides. And it's clearly on both sides. But one side doesn't get addressed for some reason.
Okay, good question. Jill, go ahead.
Well, Soros is, the biggest donor to the Democrats.
Can you grab Aaron's mic? Because I think this is important.
And Soros is the biggest donor to the Democrats and to other liberal causes, and he has been for a long time. But it's not equivalent. He is important, but the Koch network and the web of foundations and universities and think tanks, the left doesn't have that. And I'm not going to argue with you that most journalists that I know, I don't think are voting Republican. If I had to guess, that's true. But I don't think that and I worked for a decade at the Wall Street Journal, which is perceived as a conservative newspaper because of its very conservative editorial pages, opinion pages. And, I worked for nearly 20 years at the Times, which is considered, liberal because its opinion pages lean left. There's no question about that. But in terms of reporting, journalists who work on the news sides of local newspapers, radio stations, they're not, for the most part, like coming from a point of view. I'm not saying they don't, of course they have opinions, of course most of them vote, but professionals, and most journalists are professionals who've been trained, they know how to dig for the truth. And of course that involves news gathering that takes you not just to one side of an issue. To get the truth, you have to report and report and report and have enough information that if you put all of it on a scale, it's going to lean in the direction of the truth. It just does. And that doesn't mean we tell either or bland news. It means that we do the work. We find out, we talk to everybody we can get to, and we distill that and become knowledgeable enough ourselves to feel confident in both the facts and the truth of those facts.
That's a real, this is, Ali, this is something I get all the time. I imagine there are people in this audience looking at you and me and saying, you guys are all liberal, East Coast, avocado toast eating liberals. I wonder if it's, I wonder.
Glad that we have the question.
Yeah, me too. And I wonder, Jill, is it time for some newspapers are getting out of the business of opinion writing and editorial and endorsements especially?
Well, endorsements,
yeah.
Yes. They're not getting out of opinion.
Good point.
But they're getting at, for instance, on the web, and this fascinated me when I was at the Times, the institutional editorials that run, in the print paper, run right in the back on the left-hand page. Nobody reads those online.
They're not signed. They don't have a clear
They
voice.
don't have, a person to attach them to. They seem, not interesting to people. They just aren't read. So I think we're getting out of that business too, not as quickly as the endorsement business, but yeah.
I will say one thing, though. I really appreciate your question, and I think we can, if the sky we think is blue, and I think it's yellow, and you think it's green, we can spend a good amount of time, and we'll probably arrive at the fact that it's blue. The problem is, with a lot of these bad faith actors, they're arguing that there's no sky. That's the issue. The issue is not that there are two sides. There may be many sides, and I think it's our responsibility to go and find out if there's five sides to the story. I think there are bad faith actors, and it's on us to be able to call them out as bad faith actors. It's not a conservative liberal thing.
Are there bad faith actors on both sides of it?
I think empirically there are more bad faith actors on the right than there are on the left. When you say that it's Fox versus everyone else, most people getting bad faith information from the right are not getting it from Fox News. Fox News is actually becoming one of the good guys these days. Most people are getting it from garbage on the internet.
They are pretty accurate, and I watch them both.
I wouldn't go that far, but I will tell you what ends up happening is things that used to be on 8chan and 4chan then got picked up by Alex Jones or Rush Limbaugh when he was around, and then that sort of laundered the BS, which then got picked up by Lou Dobbs or somebody on Fox, and then it became Hannity, and then it became Tucker. So what happens is there's a right-wing cleansing machine that goes through very far-right, extremist, nationalist nonsense that you couldn't come across if you looked for it. But it gets its way there. That does not happen on the left. You don't find garbage that makes its way onto my show. It can't happen. We have a legal department that is the same legal. Yeah, you watch my show?
There's other shows.
I'm only here speaking for mine.
I understand.
I'm only here speaking for mine. I'm not defending all of media tonight. But I think my point is you're right, but let's identify bad faith actors. Let's just decide that there are folks that we have to say you're just lying. It's not a matter of political opinion. That's dishonest. But if you want to be honest and you want to have a conversation about how you feel about abortion or minimum wage or health care, let's have that till the cows come home.
We're going to try and get two more questions in before we break.
Hi. Hi, thanks so much just for your leadership and your, generosity and courage very much to stand up and speak truth in this time. I'm a longtime educator, including here in Philadelphia and across the country. And given the changes in the landscape of media and the needs that we have to be returning to local media and to rebuild trust across the landscape, how can we, particularly as educators and stakeholders of education, really help support building a pipeline of the next generation of you all, that we can also begin to rebuild trust and also be turning the mic to particularly voices and communities of folks who have been historically marginalized in the media, the gatekeepers, as Errin spoke about, and again, to rebuild trust and capture this momentum that we have to reclaim the radical vision of democracy that we're all still hoping for.
We have to make sure that democracy is still expanding and not contracting, right? And the classroom is, frankly, such a place where that used to happen. I mean, certainly so much of the culture war is happening at the classroom level. So thank you for everything that you are doing as well to educate, our next generation and to, create the more equitable, inclusive society, and folks that are able to discuss these things civilly, right? So that our politics, our democracy, our society, our communities, our neighborhoods are not so divided, so that we are able to actually see each other, in relationship to each other as opposed to as adversaries with each other. That kind of thing can start in the classroom, right? I mean, I think about, to the extent that I'm still on Facebook, I see my friends from high school, right? I grew up in the South. My high school was probably half white, half black. I see some of my friends, white and black, by the way, post my stories because they know me. But then they're posting some mess that they saw on Facebook, some misinformation that they found. And I'm thinking to myself, do you really equate what I do with this? But you know what? God bless them for wanting to be more informed and empowered as part of the electorate. That matters. But at the same time, I also have to recognize a lot of this is a lot more sophisticated than Hillary Clinton's alien baby on the front of the Inquirer at the checkout line, right? A lot of this dark money is being spent to produce something that is at least adjacent to what it is that we are doing. And so the media literacy piece that somebody over here brought up earlier is super important and something that I think can happen at the K through 12 level. I think it certainly needs to happen along with more critical thinking, to Ali's point, at the K through 12 level. But folks just need to learn how to engage civically again. And that can start with young folks.
I think I just want to add to that, though, that I think if we're being honest, we have to meet you there. Too much of journalism is not showing them something that they want to be interested in, right? I mean, we talk a lot about a lot of interesting things up here, but still
that Taylor Swift Ticketmaster.
Good story.
We are on that.
The majority of news in this country is still contracting, in decline, based on a business model that favors quantity over quality, that still exhibits so much of the sort of historical inequities that have always been there, problematic ownership. I mean, we have seen a wave of nonprofit newsrooms and rethinking like the 19th, and this is burgeoning, but it is nowhere near the majority. We're still showing an industry that's broken, that's non-responsive, that's not rooted in the core public service, and we have a lot of young reporters, and I'll tell you what, it's a different crop. They're so focused on making an impact, driving change, and again, not in a partisan framework, but we need to show a path where they can be a part of an organization and be proud of that organization and have that organization stand for something, and not just get lost in sort of the reductive history of journalism or our reductive politics. I mean, there's so much more to journalism on the local level than what we do. I would just challenge folks, to the extent you think about whether the national media is favoring Republicans or Democrats or who's this or who's that, think about how much time you spend thinking about that, and then think about how much time you've spent thinking about who's actually telling you who's spending your dollars on what in your town, or who's spending your dollars on what in your state legislature. Because that kind of accountability and investigative journalism crosses partisan lines. An efficient and effective government. If we're going to have government programs, well, then they should be actually achieving what they're intended to do, and we should be measuring those outcomes. We should have honest and ethical leadership. These are things that cross partisan lines, and these are the things that actually matter to our lives. But unfortunately, we get caught up in this national partisan conversation, and the national media is so loud and present. And again, no offense to Ali, but the cable news, the partisanship of the cable news landscape.
Chris, that's not fair. That's just not actually fair. Do you watch my show?
I'm not saying your show,
So let me just tell you
but listen to that question, right? That question was about Fox News, MSNBC.
This gentleman needs to watch my show too. But let me just tell you something. Errin said something interesting. We have to be in a world where democracy is expanding, not contracting. This is a global phenomenon. It is incorrect for us to think that these things that we're talking about here are what's breaking democracy. Democracy is breaking across the world. There is a contraction of democracy across the world. There's less democracy today than there was 1 year ago, and far less than there was 5 years ago. This is not cable news. This is not lying in news. This is not bias in news. This is a remarkable global lack of civic education, lack of critical thinking, and BS right-wing politics that has polluted the minds of the global population. Let's not be simplistic and say that national issues are not important when it comes to the demise of democracy, when it comes to the demise of voting rights, when it comes to the demise of abortion rights, when it comes to policing.
It is important, but the actions of national journalism actors have outsized effect on the work of journalists on the ground.
I share your
And
view
we
that
fight that battle every day, right? When Chris Cuomo commits a massive ethical breach for CNN in dealing with his brother and confirms everything people want to automatically think about journalists, that is 100 times setback for the journalists on the ground, again, writing about the issues that are not partisan, right? But now we have to fight that trust battle because that's the way media is viewed. And there has to be responsibility on that level. And I'm sorry, but there's still not enough responsibility on that level.
But is that a Chris Cuomo problem, or is that a media problem? I get your point, but
That's the viewer knowing Chris Cuomo, but not knowing who covers City Hall for the local paper. It's both, right? And it is our. I mean, look, the project that we did at the Inquirer, it just wrapped up this week. I mean, my lament is that we were not out in the community more, talking to the community more about the work that we did, being in relationship with the Philadelphians who we got to meet and whose stories we got to tell. So that collectively as Philadelphians we could try to figure out the way forward, right? I mean, yes, we did the work. It was an ambitious project in a local newspaper, but if the people that we were writing for and about are not able to benefit from that journalism, is it as successful as it could and should be? No, it's not enough. It's not enough for us to just do this journalism. Like, it has to get to the people that on whose behalf we mean for it to do something, to change something about the inequality that exists and persists in our democracy and society.
Do you all have time for one more? We've kept you about 5 minutes over, but we'll do one more and then close up here. I got the mic, dude.
Sure. Okay. I'll turn it the wrong way. Hi. Full disclosure, I had avocado toast this morning at Park at a client meeting.
Where's ours?
So, right. It was very good. So my question, more of a points-less question to respond to, is I think The Economist has it right. And that what Economist is a sort of right-of-center British publication that floods the field with facts. So they have their opinions sort of woven into their articles. But if we're facing a world of facts, it's not enough to just get a quote from each side and to have the reader try to figure it out. It just seems very useful to flood the field with facts. So, for example, the question is, did Joe Biden win the election? And you ferret out the truth by asking each side, what is your proof? right? What are the proof? What do the facts say? It's not a complete solution, but I think it's a start for reaching common ground. And then the other thing related to that is that diabolically I've been sort of looking into nutrition, and I see that the Beef Council and the Chicken Council are flooding the field with scientific research showing that fat is good for you, right? And it doesn't cause heart disease. So you have issues like that, right? And then it's the same kind of thing as like there's no such thing as global warming, and
So the false equivalency problem that objectivity gets us, is objectivity actually the problem? Has it run its course? In other words, my instinct has been from readers that they don't care about bias as much as they care about the bullshit denial of bias. What do you guys say?
Yes. I mean, objectivity is a myth, and it's easy to be objective when your default setting is a white cis male. That's who made journalism, right? So that ignores everybody else. When we are trying to tell truths plural about who we are, right? So, I mean, let's just take the voting rights example, right? We're not both siding voting rights, right? There is not one side that is funding and pushing the contraction of our democracy, and the other side that is massively funding voter fraud so that dead folk and people can vote 8 times in an that's not real. That's not the truth. Is there's a party that is pushing voter suppression because that is a means of holding power, and you can say that is not partisan, right? It didn't used to be partisan for people to give a damn about this democracy and people's ability to participate in it. But that's where we are now, because voting rights has been politicized. So yeah, objectivity is a myth, and our job again is to leave behind the most honest and accurate record of who we are.
I think if we signpost, that would be better, right? So I don't think, people tell me all the time, bias is the problem in news. Bias is not the problem in news. Bias has been around since, since the earth was invented.
The founders of journalism were biased.
Bias is fine. Truth is the thing we have to protect. Reliability and honesty. And frankly, all these awards that we journalists get nominated for and get, they're not actually about reliability and honesty. We actually, in my opinion, award the wrong things. Right, your well-written piece will get a Peabody or an Emmy or a DuPont award. I just want to know who the most reliable journalists are, all the way from the right all the, to the left. Right, and we don't signpost that. But if there's bias, and if people are concerned about it, then I would say that the criticism that we should hear and we should practice is let people know what that is. Let people know where you're coming from. I would agree. On some things, we don't have to let people know. When I cover a hurricane, I don't have to signpost that I'm against the damage that hurricanes cause, right? Now, when we get into abortion rights, or I think Erin's right. In voting rights, we shouldn't have to, we're a democracy, we shouldn't have to signpost that I'm pro-voting rights. But then we start getting to things that feel political. Is abortion a belief system? What about Black Lives Matter? What about all these other things? I think as long as you can identify where you're coming from, I don't think bias is the issue. We have a lot of lying. That's the problem we have to sort out.
Should we add one more ingredient, which is humility? Some sense that we're trying to figure things out, that some issues we have really investigated the facts. The facts are pretty clear. I agree with you about threats to democracy. But there are other things that are still percolating in society. We don't have all the answers. Yes. And so in those cases, it's actually important to present many sides and to be honest about and humble about what we don't know. And I sometimes think that journalists lose trust by seeming too sure.
Journalists are allergic to I don't know.
Yes.
You made this point right about the midterm elections. That's we lost more trust in the midterm elections because everybody knew it was going to be this, and then it turned out not to be that. And your point was that because we were talking sometimes to the wrong people. Because to Chris's point, we weren't going to people who could actually tell us what was going on. We were going to pundits.
And also, historically, it's always been this. Like a lot of times we cover journalism like we cover sports, but a lot of times we really don't. Like if you went into a game saying, well, Penn State beat, whatever school 80 times in the last 100 years. That doesn't mean they're going to lose today. We have no idea. We actually have no idea if they're going to lose today. But we cover
Well, yeah. So we've kept you guys longer than we promised. So I really want to thank you. Despite your avocado toast eating proclivities, you are frontline workers. So thank you all so much, and thank you especially, Ali. And we'll see you guys tomorrow.